Welcome, everybody, to another episode of the Wildcast podcast. We are simulcasting once again. You can listen on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, or you're probably watching us either on social media or at Tucson.com, as we now have this video option. You're looking at Brett Ferris, sports editor of the Arizona Daily Star, and Michael Lev, our senior writer and columnist, here the day after the heavy load in McKale Center. There's another one of those in like 3 weeks. But this was the first of two this season where the Arizona women's basketball team and Arizona men's basketball teams played on the same day at home on the UA campus at McKale. And Michael was there for basically all of it. Michael, you and Mamta Popat, our photographer, were basically there all day. Do I have to ask, did you leave at all in between the games, or did you just kind of hang out and find a cot somewhere in a corner where the janitors hang out?
No, we both left, not together, but went for a lunch break.
Yeah.
In between, there was a decent chunk of time after the women's post game and before the men's game got started. And it was a nice day too. So, go for a walk I went to Chiba Hut, which is a catty corner from the campus there at Campbell and 6th. Good scene there. KJ Lewis was having lunch there with his family. Look like before he headed over to McKale Center.
Hey, that's a great for his game last night. That is a great endorsement of Chiba Hut. Without they are not paying us for this, but he played great last night.
He might not want to change his routine after having such a good game, right?
Yeah, for the Arizona getting avenging and getting revenge on Stanford for the loss on I think New Year's Eve. And being able to get a win, even though they were down 11 at the half, came back and won by 11. So a 22-point swing in that second half for the men's basketball team. The women's basketball team played really well earlier in the day. A totally different game than what Arizona saw at ASU only 6 weeks ago, where they won by almost 40. Part of that is the roster situation, but 18 and 15 from Esmer Martinez, and you're probably going to win just about any night. And Arizona was able to do that yesterday over ASU, also winning by 11 to sweep the season series over the Sun Devils, their 5th straight win over their rivals from Tempe.
Indeed. Yeah. So the men's game, the two games are really different in the sense that even though the women were tied at one point in time with ASU, you never felt like they were going to lose that game. It just felt like they were in control from the start. The men, man, you weren't sure. Like it felt like a carbon copy of the first Stanford game, at least in the first half, where the Cardinals were just on fire and they were raining in threes. Even though they were missing one of their best players, there was kind of a matchup issue, I think, with that team and Maxime Renaud, who's, I guess the closest thing to a center for Stanford, kind of a more of a perimeter type of player, not the kind of guy who's going to camp out in the low block. And that makes it a hard matchup for Umar Ballo, and Maxime Renaud was red hot from outside early. And Stanford was able to, after Arizona caught up, Stanford was able to pull away at the end of the first half. And it was interesting to talk to Tommy Lloyd afterward. And, people were asking him, oh, did you have a big speech for the team in the locker room? And he basically said, no, I just try to stay calm and confident. And he believes that like whatever his demeanor is will be reflected in the team, that if he starts ranting and raving that they might lose their composure and that wouldn't lead to a positive result.
This may be unfair, but haven't we seen that here at Arizona before Tommy Lloyd got here? I mean, I'm not trying to be, we've seen it with football teams. We've seen it specifically with basketball, though. Like the personality of Sean Miller compared to Tommy Lloyd, the teams, we've seen that. The team sort of follows that to some degree, and it changes their ability, whether they can dig out of an 11-point halftime hole or will just kind of crumble and go on to the next one.
Yeah, Adia Barnes talked about something similar to that too, just about her kind of sideline demeanor and referencing sort of coaches that rant and rave over there. I felt like they were kind of both talking about Bobby Hurley without talking about Bobby Hurley, but neither one of them made any direct reference to that particular coach, who I actually like. He's just a super hyper competitive guy who wears his emotions on his sleeve on the sideline, to be sure. Like if you ever see him in an interview setting, he's not like that. But then again, kind of Rich Rod was like that sometimes too. He could be really calm and thoughtful. And then there were just times on the sideline, or we saw it in the coach's box when he was at Ole Miss, or was it Mississippi State? where he just lost it, like he just couldn't handle losing. But anyway, they handled all of the waves that Stanford threw at them very well. And the difference in the game, what turned out to be kind of the thing that flipped it around, was defense. And with KJ Lewis and Jaden Bradley on the floor, along with Caleb Love and Pella Larson basically playing the power forward position, that is a great defensive lineup. You could throw Keyshawn Johnson in that mix too, another elite defender. That's a lot of athleticism, and they can create a lot of problems. Jaden Bradley had a box score where if you looked at it and you weren't really like paying very much attention to the game, you'd be like, oh, this guy had a minimal influence. He had 5 points, shot 1 for 5 from the floor. But you know what? He was one of the top 2 guys in the team in plus minus, along with KJ Lewis. So what does that tell you? I mean, those guys are influencing the game on the defensive end of the floor.
Right.
And that's what turned things around. I mean, they cranked up the pressure. They were able to get runouts, fast breaks, turnover Stanford, and Stanford started to go cold too. I mean, you're not gonna hit 64% of your 3-pointers in any given game at any point. So they started out super hot. They ended up kind of cold. They took way more 3-pointers than Arizona did at the end of the day.
30.
It's always one of those. Yeah, that's a lot.
That's a lot.
It's always one of those things. You live by the sword, die by the sword, live by the 3, die.
I mean, they shot 43%. So because of that first
it's
half,
not bad.
48% in the first half, 35 in the second half. Neither of those are that horrible. And a total game of 42% or 43%. But 33 threes is a lot.
But if you look at points in the paint, which is a stat that Arizona almost always controls, they doubled them in points in the paint. It was 48-24.
Yep. So
that's just, it's kind of how Tommy Lloyd wants to play. And that was another common thread between the 2 games, that Arizona also dominated in the paint against ASU in the women's game in a major way. Aiden Wohl, who was covering the game for us, and we were looking at some stats afterward. The last 2 wins that the women's team has had against ASU and Cal, the fewest 3-point attempts they've taken in any games this season, 5 and 6 respectively. So,
which to me,
both teams are inside-out teams.
Yeah, Adia Barnes has talked about that a ton. I have 2 questions about the men's team before we shift gears completely. We don't have to yet, but Keyshawn Johnson kind of went down. His arm, I say went down, but it was his arm, I believe. What feeling did you get post game for how he's doing? He only played 17 minutes, didn't have any points. Obviously that was part of that. At least I'm assuming that was part of that. It wasn't foul trouble or anything like that. And then the second piece, Umar Ballo, again, compared to the last month or so, we talked about Kylan Boswell's struggles. Umar Ballo had some struggles. The last 2 games, he has been exactly what this team needs. As we saw Purdue play against Wisconsin, 2 teams Arizona saw earlier in the season, and Purdue up by 2 at the half and sort of ran away with it in the second half. Both top 10 teams that Arizona's faced. Purdue looks like the team. Arizona's going to need Umar Ballo if those teams happen to run into each other in the tournament, if Arizona can kind of keep this together. And a game like yesterday and a game like Thursday night against Cal, if he can duplicate that, Arizona looks pretty solid. So first about Keyshawn Johnson, what's your take from the post?
Yeah, he got injured on a baseline drive. It looked like the offensive player's shoulder or elbow hit Keyshawn in his kind of shoulder or upper arm area. It was his left arm. He came back into the game. I think it was just a situation where this just wasn't his game, and other guys were playing really well. Tommy seemed to indicate after the game that the injury was not a huge deal, and that they just had a better lineup with some other guys out there. I mean, the finishing lineup didn't feature 2 of the starters because KJ Lewis and Jaden Bradley were playing so well.
And am I crazy to think that that's a good thing? You don't need, Caleb Love went for 39 minutes and 18 points and Ballo had 18 and 13. But if you can get contributions elsewhere that allow some of these guys, Keyshawn Johnson has been an absolute stud for this team and probably better than advertised coming from San Diego State for how important he's been to this team. So to have him not have it be his night and yet still able to manage that, that's only a good thing. I mean, I can't see a negative on that at all, other than hopefully his confidence is high for this team.
Yeah. Well, there was a big discussion about that afterward, and Tommy was pretty insistent, and the guys who talked, which were Jaden and KJ, before Tommy, were pretty insistent that they're kind of all for one for all. They don't care who gets the credit. They don't really care that much about the minutes or who gets the points or whatever. They have a good team culture. I mean, we'll see. I think one of the reasons that he hasn't made a change with the starting lineup is he's concerned how it will impact someone like Kylan Boswell if he were to be coming off the bench after being a starter. Like, how would that affect him mentally? So, that's TBD. It doesn't seem like Tommy's going to change, and it does seem like they have a good culture. But when it comes to that, he explicitly said that Keyshawn was happy for the other guys and for the team result. So we'll take them for their word. As far as Ballo goes, he's looked really good the last couple games. I mean, doubles, forceful in the paint, getting some nice elevation for block shots and for dunks. And, there was a lot of, when you're watching him just anecdotally, it didn't seem like he was getting great lift earlier in the season, and maybe he might be in better shape now too. And that was also something that fans were kind of like, oh, he's out of shape. He's not, I think there's a tendency in society and in sports media and among fans to talk about what players aren't rather than what they are, or talk about what they lack as opposed to what they have. And I think Oumar Ballo kind of falls victim to that because he just doesn't look like the modern big man. He's more like the old school big man, and maybe it feels like the game has evolved past that type of player. But there is a spot for a guy like that still in college basketball, and he has shown in this last stretch of games that he can still be very effective.
The one thing that stood out to me too in that game last night, and I was kind of intermittently catching it. I was not at the game. I caught a good chunk of it, mostly in the second half, but Stanford only shot 6 free throws the whole game. Is that a testament to Arizona's defense and being able to press and pressure without going overboard and fouling? Is that a testament to just the way that home cooking kind of works sometimes when momentum swings? I know I'm assuming, I'm not saying they've said it, but I'm assuming on Stanford's side, no one who follows that team and supports that team is happy to see an 18-6 free throw disparity in a game where you were up by 11 and lost by 11.
Well, I mean, I think it's as simple as this. It's what you mentioned before, 33 3-point attempts out of 68 field goal attempts.
Yeah.
That is going to drive down your trips to the line, plain and simple. If you're a perimeter type team that's going to chuck it from outside, you're just not going to draw as many. And weirdly enough, I mean, Arizona in the first half had only 2 free throw attempts. They were both by Ballo, so no one else on the team. There was a point early in the second half, I think he was 2 for 4. He was the only guy who had taken a free throw attempt on the entire team. They ended up with more than that by the end of the game. They had, let me look it up here real quick. They ended up with 18 free throw attempts. So they were able to get to the basket more. They were able to draw fouls. Tommy mentioned that Stanford's actually a really good team at defending without fouling. That's one of their fortes. But they were able to get to the line. And how do you get to the line? I mean, you go to the basket.
You drive.
When you have a big man too, like Oumar Ballo, he's going to draw a lot of attention. Some teams are even going to foul him intentionally because he's not a great free throw shooter. So I think it's a style of play thing combined with, there's always that kind of home court whistle that you get in the sport of college basketball when there's a big crowd. It's just a human nature type of thing. I feel like that kind of steals the whistle in your direction.
As we shift gears from the men's win last night to the women's win yesterday afternoon on Sunday, Tommy Lloyd, we talk a lot about Adia Barnes' roster and only having 7 players. Tommy Lloyd went with 8. Mo Krivas, 11 minutes. Keyshawn Johnson, like we said, kind of a little bit banged up, only played 17 minutes. So really you combine things, and Tommy Lloyd was, it was a 7+ man rotation, which is not all that different from what we've seen with the Arizona women's basketball team, yet it feels a lot different. And maybe that's because when you have Filippo Vikanen and some of these guys sitting there in the waiting, if some reason Keyshawn Johnson can't play a game or Mo Crevis isn't the guy. They've got a couple more that can go. The women's basketball team doesn't as much. And heading into the game against ASU on Sunday, their third straight game going with only 7 players. Their leading scorer, Kaylin Gilbert, out again for undisclosed reasons. Adia Barnes said post-game it was not medical as to why she was not out, even though we have seen Kaylin Gilbert with a brace on her back, and she has mentioned kind of dealing with back issues, but that it was more getting her back into the system or conditioning. There was various words she used over the week. Protocol, she said that word. So a question came up, was it concussion? No. And she actually had a funny answer, which I like, which was not even the best answer she gave to a question on the day, where she said, if I say it's, how did she word it? She basically gave away when it's going to be a concussion because she can't say it's a concussion.
Yeah,
but if she
says if
word,
I say it's for medical reasons,
but don't say
I don't
why,
specify, then it's probably a concussion, right?
Yeah. But anyway, the team, the Wildcats, just like Umar Ballo getting 18 and 13 down low and having that paint down low presence, Esmir Martinez did the same for the women's basketball team, 18 and 15. To lead to an 11-point win over ASU. Kind of tell me your thoughts, Michael, about the women's game yesterday, the game itself, and then we'll get into some of the post-game reaction.
Yeah, like I said, it felt like they were in control throughout, even though it was tight for certain periods, and ASU did rally to tie. I mean, ASU is also missing some of their key pieces. I think the biggest factor in the game are 2 things. One, Arizona got a whole week off. Right, it was their only game of the week, and when you have only 7 healthy players, it really helps to have extra rest. They, in fact, have this upcoming week. They have the LA trip, but the second game is a Monday night on ESPN2, so they get an extra day in between. I think
Friday, Monday
for them
is a really interesting breakdown for them.
Yeah, Diaz didn't seem too thrilled about facing Juju Watkins on national TV because she, obviously Juju Watkins is unbelievable. Yeah. But I think the extra day of rest will help, and it's always cool to get that pop on ESPN2. And then the other thing was they stayed out of foul trouble. That's been a huge issue for them. I think the fact that, ASU doesn't have those bigs inside to create the foul trouble was a huge thing for them. Brea Cunningham being able to play in the fourth quarter, without worrying about fouls. She dominated in the fourth quarter. She had 8 of her 11 points, scoring with ease, setting up on the low block, very Umar Ballo-like in terms of the way she was able to get positioning very close to the basket. Those were big things to me. Esmir Martinez, of course, she played through a migraine. She's just a warrior. Adia Barnes said she's a beast, and I think it's true. And she's not the biggest. I mean, she's listed at 6'2". I'm not sure she's 6'2". She's definitely not bulky. Like, she's got a pretty thin frame, but she's fearless, and she just mixes it up in there. And just doesn't seem to care if she ends up on the floor or has a migraine or is vomiting before the game, all of which were true. She just gets it done. And then Helena Puello, great all-around game, completely stuffed the stat sheet, also defended ASU's best player and held her to 4 of 17 from the floor. So common theme again between the 2 games, veterans stepping up. When I asked Tommy Lloyd about Umar Ballo after the game, he was like, it's time. Now is the time. Now is the time for Esmir Martinez and Helena Puello because their careers are coming to an end. Well,
and in Helena Puello's case, like we talked to her this past week. James Kelly wrote a story about her and how, she at times will not be seen on the scoring part of the stat sheet, but will be seen in other areas. And even if she's not really seen in other areas, statistically, will still have 35, 37, 39 minutes because of the trust that Adia Barnes has in her to lead this team as a 5th year. What's so fascinating, though, I mean, and we're not talking 30, 40, 50. We're not talking Juju Watson numbers here, but you look at the games over the last, since the Pac-12 play really started. First game in the Pac-12 against ASU, they won by about 40. Helena Puello goes for 18. They lost to Gonzaga. She had 12. Beat Seattle. She had 12. Lost to Colorado, 9. Beat Utah, 20 points, her season high. Lost to Oregon State in the next game, 0. Fast forward to Washington State, 2 and 6. Cal, 7 points, so not massive. But, I mean, back on the score sheet, Stanford, 0. ASU, 11. So, I mean, there is a correlation that Helena Puello cannot just not score. I know that her game is to distribute and to facilitate, and she's very good at it. But when she scores, and it might be a 6 of one, half dozen of another, chicken and egg, when she scores, this team plays better. But when this team plays better, the points come for her. So at the same time, as soon as I saw her start approaching, the 7-8 point range, that was my thought, that this team's going to pull away because they're finding a way to get it to more than just 2 or 3 people. She's actually in the mix heavily at that point. The rest thing was huge for her. It was obvious. And I don't mean this to be hypercritical, but you could tell visibly how tired she was against Stanford. And Adia Barnes mentioned taking her out for an extra few minutes at the end of the game when she normally would have played, just because at some point, like, you can see it on the players' faces, she had the energy back Sunday against ASU.
Yeah, she doesn't take her out very often. I mean, she played 37 minutes in that game. She's regularly been playing 39
That's low.
or 40 minutes. 37's low. Yeah.
40, 45, 49, so 2 overtime games, 39, 38, 39, 40, and then 33 against Stanford and back to 37 against ASU. Yeah. So, probably in the top 2 or 3 in minutes played in the conference.
And because she's asked often to cover the other team's best perimeter player, she's spending a lot of energy on that end, right? So she doesn't have an opportunity to rest during the game either. And I think there's a cumulative effect of all those minutes. It's not something that Adia Barnes wants to do, but they've gotten into the situation where they kind of have to. And she's, her most reliable and versatile and well-rounded player, someone that she really doesn't want to take off the floor if she can avoid it.
So a few more minutes before we wrap up here, but we want to get into a discussion of what Adia Barnes said post-game. And in a vacuum, without anything around it, it was a fascinating kind of just, I don't want to say rant, it was just sort of a riff from her on the topic of sort of outside distraction, social media, how all these things sort of play into the makeup of a team. But there actually is underpinnings to this. The fact there's only 7 players on the roster is connected to that there has been in and outflow of players the last few years. And that's natural. And that's all of college basketball and women's college basketball in particular. But it specifically has hit hard here because she did choose to go with a little bit smaller lineup to start the season, started with 11, added 1 midway through after an injury. That's now down to 7, as you saw, because Kaylin Gilbert's status is unknown and Maya Nagy leaving the team back in December. And the comments yesterday from Adia Barnes were sort of centered on some things that Maya Nagy had said back in December. PJ Brown, our colleague, and myself had a story that came out yesterday about Maya Nagy's reaction to her own comments, where she referenced the team or the environment. It was not hyper specific, and she wouldn't answer when we caught up to her this past week. When PJ caught up to her, she wouldn't say anything on this word, but she referenced the word toxic, and that the situation was that. And so a question was asked during the post-game press conference after Sunday's game about the sort of circling of those comments. And we've got that clip right here.
You just can't. I think you have to realize, like, I'm an adult. I'm 47 years old. And I'm just more mature. And I think that players are young and emotional. So after some certain situations, you get really emotional and then you say things. I think sometimes you'll regret them, but that's just kind of how it is. So our players a lot of times don't see it, don't realize it. Oh, my son. But you just can't. It's hard to get on Twitter and just talk about things because everything's so public and everybody has an opinion about everything. So they just don't really pay a lot of attention. But then usually I find out from the players, though, because I won't follow certain people and I'll be getting like, someone will text them. I'll get like 50 texts from people all around the country. The players, did you see this? I'm like, no. So it ticks you off when you see it. But it's social media. There's so many people that have like 2 followers. It's easy to hide behind like Twitter and say stuff, because the best coaches are on Twitter, right? Or watching TV with the remote control. Those are great coaches. But when you're in the situation, it's harder. So I just think you can't get caught up into that. And just people are emotional. And like, I think as a coach, one of the hardest things I can tell you as a coach, so there's stuff that goes on, right? Like, you guys are lucky I can't say the truth about everything because people would I could change everybody's opinion about so many things. Like, if people knew the truth, and as a coaches, and every coach in the country goes through this, like, there's so many things you can't say or decisions you make that leads to, say, someone leaving or something, or there's a reason, but you can never say it. So the coaches always have to sit there and smile, and we just take punches. And that's hard. I mean, that's hard sometimes, but it comes with the territory, and you just have to smile. And what do they say, Michelle Obama? When they go low, we go high. Sometimes you're like, I want to go low too, but you can't. And it's like, I'm the adult, and so you have to like be above stuff, and you have to be a role model for your players, because then it's contagious, and they start doing it, and it's stuff that is just a distraction. And what I want to worry about is the 7 I have or the 8, when we have 8, and then I want us to be our best and I want us to be professional. And the reality is the 7 know the reality and the truth. And you can see it on the floor because if we weren't cohesive and we weren't didn't have great culture, they wouldn't fight like they do. And that's very obvious. And then I think as spectators, you see when we started to excel and when we play our best, and we're playing good basketball with 7 players and not as much talent as most other teams. So if you don't have a good cohesive culture and you don't have that, you're not going to see that on the court. And that's the reality. And I think that's pretty obvious for people that know basketball. So those girls, and they all say 10 toes down, they all fight, and they have my back, we have each other's back, and that's the reality. And I mean, I think that really shows, and that's the most important thing for me. So you gotta forget about all the noise.
That was a lot. It was great. I mean, there's so many things. I love the part the best basketball coaches are on Twitter. The Michelle Obama, when they go low, we go high, but sometimes you want to go low. Like that was a quote. I mean, talk about sound bites right there. But there was a lot, and it was all about, like I said, the underpinnings tied to things that had popped up this week. So when Adia Barnes and the basketball program announced that they were going to have walk-on tryouts on Thursday, social media started talking about it. And the question that's sort of been asked a few times, and there's this idea that we're not trying to cover it. We're just not hyper speculating because we want to politic in news. We don't want to necessarily politic in what might be the issues. There are folks that will do that. That's not necessarily what we do all the time. We do it a little bit on this podcast, but this question started coming up of what's going on with this program. And then simultaneously, screenshots of Maya Naji responding to people asking, what's the real story why you left? Because she mentioned academics and her being part of the accelerated pathway to medical education program, which is a 7-year undergraduate and graduate program that she will leave with an MD if she sticks with it. And I believe that's part of it, but I think there's always deeper things. And so she had, like I said before, used the word toxic. And so this was sort of in reaction to a question about that. And, I'll yield the floor to you, Michael. You were in the room for that. Kind of share what stood out to you about what Adia Barnes said in that moment.
Sure. Well, first of all, I would say similar to Adia Barnes, there are certain things that we know that we can't talk about either, because it might be a sensitive personal type of issue related to the subject that we're covering, right? Or it could be something that we've heard that might be true, but we're in the business where we need to have a second or third confirmation, right, before we report on something that might be considered controversial, right, in some regard. So that's why with this particular subject, with players leaving the team, specifically Kaylin Gilbert not playing, there are certain things we've heard. I don't know if there are certain things we can say that we know, right? So that's why we've kind of had to dance around it a little bit, similar to the way Adia is dancing around it. So that was number one. Number two, when she said it off the top, I'm 47 years old, I'm an adult, I'm more mature, people immediately on social media took that out of context and were like, oh, why Adia Barnes is mature? If she's so mature, then why are all these people leaving the program? She was talking about what you should say, what you shouldn't say, what you can say, what you can't say. That's the part she was talking about. She's talking about kind of emotional maturity in your comportment, not rushing to social media, like she's following the Herm Edwards guidance, right? Don't press send.
One thing that before you jump to number 3 is I wasn't even certain in that moment watching it. And I was not in the arena, but I was watching it live as it was being broadcast. And by the way, thank you. Arizona Athletics posts these videos on social media or on YouTube and social media. That's where we got that clip from. I want to make sure I cite them. They have all the press conferences available. I wasn't totally sure she was even talking about Maya Naji in that exact early sentiment, even though that was what the question was about. I think it was about that, but it was a combination of not just, well, I'm more mature than Maya Naji. I don't think that's what she was necessarily saying. I think what she was saying is the noise starts to become a cyclone and a vortex on social media. And, to sort of defend Maya Naji and in PJ Brown in my story, she talks about this. She wasn't diving into, and yes, she used a strong word saying the word toxic, but what she was trying to say was there are deeper issues than beyond just, do I want to play basketball? Do I want to study? and that's a black and white, left and right thing. There's more to it than that, and people were making assumptions. And so I think Adia Barnes's discussion of that was totally encapsulating all of it. I want to be fair to her and fair to Maya Nagy that I don't believe it was necessarily right in the direct response that I think Maya Nagy shouldn't have said these things. I don't know what Adia Barnes thinks on that, but
yeah, I wish that Maya Nagy had directly addressed the term toxic. And we tried and pressed her on that, and she just wouldn't explain exactly what she meant by that. It was not the best choice of words if that's not what she meant, but maybe it is what she meant. So that leads to number 3, right? Which is,
well, there's also an
issue.
assumption of that toxic means it's a toxic environment with toxic people. It could just be, it created toxicity for me where,
right.
So again, to your point, an explanation of that could have been helpful. And, it's her prerogative to not say it. PJ was the one who talked to her over the weekend, and that's up to, that's totally her prerogative on how she answers that. It still didn't clarify much.
Right. Okay. So that leads to the issue of culture, right? Which is a word that we talk about all the time in regard to college sports programs. I think is actually one of the really good things that Jedd Fisch did here during his time as a football coach, is he turned the culture around in a big way. Tommy Lloyd talks about it all the time. We talked earlier in the podcast about the teamwork and all for one and one for all that business. So does women's basketball have a culture problem? I think it's a complicated question. There definitely has been an outflow of pretty good players who've transferred in the last couple of years. They've had turnover on the coaching staff as well. But as Adia Barnes pointed out, the ones who are here are playing really hard. And one of the things you look for, to me, in sort of figuring out, does a program have good culture, is the effort level. Are the players playing as hard as they can, win or lose? I think you saw that in Jedd Fisch's first year. I think it was a positive sign that no matter what was going on in the game, the guys were playing hard from the beginning of the game to the end. And I think you're seeing that with the 7 players who are still active for women's basketball, right? They are playing their hearts out there for Adia Barnes. You saw that birthday video, right? I think that did not seem contrived to me. Yeah. Like, those players were genuinely happy to celebrate her birthday with her. So
here's a great one. One. This weekend, Sam Thomas and Bendu Yini, 2 pieces. Yeah. Sam Thomas, obviously legendary in programs lore, but 2 pieces of the national championship runner-up team from 2021. God, I get the year. I can't believe it was in 4 years. It's a pandemic, but I think 2021. Right, yeah. Mm-hmm. They were in town, put on some clinics. We're in Tucson. Bendu Yini was at Arizona, transferred to Arizona, played for a couple of years, and then left and transferred again. And yet still, we think of players transfer because of the things we're talking about. They hate the coach. There's no fit. But yet she is speaking incredibly high of Adia Barnes this weekend and the value that she brought to her life during difficult times and as a coach. And I don't know off the top of my head. I've heard things, again, not something I'm going to say right here, but I don't know why Bendu Yini left and transferred. But there's a respect level that exists there. So it's possible that there's nuance to a lot of these things, I guess, is my point. The other thing really quick, as you mentioned Jedd Fisch and culture, there was a video of Jedd Fisch getting introduced at the Washington basketball game over the weekend. And he's had those social media things where he's talked about families travel, and he kind of mentioned that. But then he also said, our culture traveled too. And I thought that was funny because that was a huge part of his sticking point and selling point here in Tucson. And he's saying we're bringing that same logic with us there, but it was just funny to hear him actually say our culture traveled with us. I think the culture's still here a little bit. There's a pretty decent culture around Arizona football right now too. Yeah, not to get on that sidetrack.
It's not a tangible thing. I mean, it's something that you have to build over time. So real quick on Adia, because I know we've kind of already gone over our goal for the length of this podcast, but thanks for everyone for sticking around. If you stuck around this long. So here's my take on Adia. Even though she is relatively young, she just turned 47 years old. I think she's kind of old school a little bit. Like, she emphasizes defense. She coaches hard. She tells the truth. She doesn't sugarcoat things with her players. And I think a lot of players these days, they don't want to hear the truth about themselves. They don't want to be criticized, and they don't want to be coached hard. And the way things are set up now, you've got this escape hatch that is really easy to access. If you don't like the way things are going, you can just transfer somewhere else. to me, and again, this is speculation, but I think most of the transfers have been kind of an offshoot of that thing.
Mm-hmm.
That players just, they don't want to be criticized and they don't want to be coached hard. And the easiest thing to do is to just go somewhere else and not have to deal with that anymore.
Look, there are issues, and that's not even a negative. That just means there's things that Adia Barnes obviously has to deal with in terms of this program. That goes without saying. We can debate, not just you and me, but anybody can debate what those are and whether they're good, bad, or otherwise. But Thursday, it was interesting during her press conference leading up to the weekend games. Was it Thursday? Yeah, it was Thursday.
Yeah, it was Thursday. Yeah.
Where she said she specifically discussed her breaking up with players, and her deciding, this relationship isn't going to work having you on my team anymore. And it doesn't mean they were bad players. I want to reverse put words in Adia's mouth and say, we have no opinion of what she thinks about them as human beings, even as basketball players. She probably still thinks highly, but she was specifically talking about fit, culture, the things we're talking about. And I'm going to give her a little bit of grace on that and credit on that, if it's not just, I got to keep everybody at all times. The problem is she admits that she made the decision to go with a lighter roster load this year, although that's happening across college basketball. Tara Vanderveer at Stanford usually carries a lot, is carrying only about 12. There's a lot of schools that have dealt with this. Obviously TCU, the ironic connection, Madison Connor, who was here, didn't get a ton of playing time, was a reserve who saw spots of prolificness, transfers to TCU, and all of a sudden is scoring 23, 24 points a game and leading the NCAA in 3-pointers over someone we might have heard of named Caitlin Clark. And then gets hurt. And she's one of the 4 that gets hurt that requires TCU to then go do walk-on tryouts. And so there's a lot of interesting correlations. We talked about this with football, all the small worldness of Washington, San Jose State, Arizona, Alabama, all the things that have changed. It's in college basketball too. And I think there's a lot to this. And it's not that we're giving a pass. I think it's just a matter of continuing to push and dig on our end as journalists, but also what they're trying to do to complete to build their program moving forward. Something that you said interesting about the 7 players, sorry about my dogs are barking. Something you said interesting about the 7 players playing hard. Even the players that aren't there right now have played hard. Sally Karuma is the best example of this. And yes, there's part and parcel with a lot of these things, but she originally got hurt. She's out for the year had to get shoulder surgery. She originally got hurt in the exhibition game, the second exhibition against Point Loma, where Arizona only had 5 players, and she played 39 minutes and 40 seconds and dove for a loose ball out of bounds and separated her shoulder. They popped it back in. She played for the next month and a half until it was just too much and she needed to take a step back. But if you look at the fact that she even played after knowing she was going to get surgery because they really needed that roster spot full, that's a prime example to me of what you're saying, of these players are willing to play hard for her. It's just there's only 7 or 8 or 9 of them right now. And that's not fair to the other ones that have been hurt. But the point is there's not enough to sustain this over the course of a successful season. And that's where I think Adia Barnes probably knows that there's things she's got to do in the offseason to change that.
Yeah, I think 2 things as we close here. Number one, and this is
number one, Brett talk less. That's the first thing that's here. But
number one, it would be a great discussion to have with her. Is she going to revisit things when she's on the recruiting trail in terms of character, makeup, fit? Maybe she's going to not take the super talented players, but maybe look for players who fit the culture a little bit better, who are coachable. So I think that is one thing for sure that she's going to have to look at. And then the other thing I'll bring up is you can make a case that this is the best on-court coaching job that she has done since she's
took
been
the words
here,
out of my mouth.
Given how few players she has available. Now, some of that is her own doing, right? Because she chose to have a smaller roster, and some of the players have decided to leave, or she couldn't, figure out a way to work things out with them. Some of it is not her fault because of injuries. But in terms of what she has and what she's getting out of them, she has done a pretty spectacular job of super competitive losses against teams that are ranked higher than them, and then pulling out some wins as well with only 7 or 8 players.
I agree entirely with that. I've been saying that for the last couple of weeks. And again, she made that comment yesterday about the best coaches are on Twitter. I'm not trying to be that guy, but so I have no other than our job as sports journalists, I have no understanding directly of what she goes through on a day-to-day basis in this role. What I think the question is not, can she coach basketball? I think the question is, running a program and the longevity of that. And I'm not saying she can't. I'm just saying I think that's the question tied to all of these things. It's absolutely clear to your point that that the team is responding to her from a coaching standpoint. And some people will always criticize late game decisions and whatever. I mean, people did that. I did that with Lute Olson decisions, that he used to kind of sit back and just let his guys show their talent and play. Those are different mentalities that coaches have. But the reality of it is a heck of a coaching job. It doesn't mean the other questions go away. It is important to remember that. And hey, beat ASU 5 straight times, twice this year. In some sports, football included, a 500 or a 6-5 back in the old 11 schedule day, or a 7-5 record and beating ASU was considered a good year. So, expectations are a little higher for a team that recently went to the Final Four, but if this team finishes, 16-13, makes the WNIT and wins a game or two and beat ASU twice, maybe 3 times if they see them again in the Pac-12 tournament, is that really a failure of a year? I maybe, but I'm saying it deserves to at least be questioned.
Agreed. Yeah. And we'll have more discussion about Adia's team and Tommy's team as we move forward here. The calendar has flipped to February, which means we're nearing March, when that's basketball, that's college basketball time. And one of the 2 teams for sure will be playing in the NCAA tournament. The other one, they're going to have to make a run here and face a very tough schedule coming up too. The women do. Probably looking more like a WNIT, but hey, you know what? That was not the worst thing in the world. The last time that happened, they ended up winning that tournament, and it was kind of a launching pad for what was to come. So, interesting times for both programs, and a lot to talk about for us here coming up.
A lot. Michael, thank you so much for not just being here today to chat with me, but for spending most of your Sunday in McKale. There's worse places to be than McKale to watch a couple of good basketball games with, combined 22,000 of your closest friends between the 2 games. If you're listening to this, obviously you're listening to the podcast forum. So remember to subscribe at Apple Podcasts or Spotify to the Wildcast podcast. If you are watching us, thank you for doing so. You're probably watching us on Tucson.com or through at the Wildcaster on Twitter or Facebook. Remember to download the Wildcaster app for all U of A sports news from Michael Lev, Bruce Pascoe, PJ Brown, Justin Spears, Greg Hansen, occasionally me, James Kelly, Aiden Wall, our whole team of correspondents. Thanks again for watching and listening, and we will check you out later this week.